Hello and welcome to the PhD Life Raft podcast. I'm Emma Brzezinski and today I am talking to the gorgeous Jessamy Gleeson. Jessamy is talking about her own experience of PTSD as a result of a research project. And we talk together about the process of really looking after yourself and recognising your vulnerability as a researcher. So I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, Jess.
Hi, Emma.
Thank you so much for getting up early in the morning.
It's all good. It's my pleasure.
And also to agree to speak about this because we're going to talk about some difficult stuff today, and I know will be really helpful to people. And I'd really appreciate you offering to come and talk about it. Yeah, thank you.
Not a problem. Happy to be here and happy to talk about it because I think, in all honesty, it's really important to talk about this stuff. So that's why I'm here.
So we're going to get into talking about PTSD in a minute. Mm-hmm. But first of all, I always ask people to talk about their own journey through the PhD and out the other side. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey.
Of course. So I studied in Melbourne in Australia, and I studied at Swinburne University of Technology for my PhD. And I started that in 2012, and it was on feminism, feminist activism, and representations of women in the mainstream media. And I finished my PhD a few years ago and then commenced further research as a result. So the PhD journey itself was probably about as difficult as your standard PhD was, which is to say that it encompasses all those wonderful and slightly difficult experiences of supervisors and confirmations and editing and all of that. But it was the what came next for me, but the PTSD that we'll get to, which in fairness I have read and published about, can also happen during the PhD journey. So the PhD experience itself was on feminism, gender studies.
Love that. And I love that you said standards, difficulties.
Oh, I know. Because it's so, no one talks about it. I was speaking to a friend of mine yesterday. Well, I guess this is the point of this, that we do talk about it, but it's the amount of people who experience challenges with mental health or just all around difficult PhD experiences, and it's seen as acceptable, is something that, I'd really like to help destigmatize, but also just how hard it is and how challenging it is seems to be accepted by so many.
Yes, absolutely. And that is why we're here to talk about it. And I think also what feels really important to me is a lot of people feel like it's just them and then kind of take that on themselves, that there's something wrong with them. And actually, there's systems out there that are problematic. There's all sorts of things that we kind of need to call out. And I love that you're on the crew. I love it.
Yeah. Look, it's not you, it's the academy, right?
Exactly that. So let's get into this then. So you have been researching in the area of PTSD. So first of all, I think most people are going to know this, but just to kind of refresh us on what PTSD is, and then to perhaps talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So PTSD is a very specific term that it relates to exposure to trauma or traumatic material. There is a very specific definition that it fits within that you can access if you look at what we often know now as the DSM-5, so the diagnostic manual that a lot of clinicians use. And it's either being directly exposed to very serious incidents of trauma or being more indirectly exposed to aversive details of a traumatic traumatic event. And that usually covers people, that second category usually covers people like first responders, police officers, so on and so forth. But it can also cover people who are researching these things. And that's a definition that has been broadened out in recent years. And when I say, you know, I've been researching PTSD, in fairness, it's a fairly academic way of just saying I've written about my own experience of PTSD, because the research has been limited to myself up until now. So it's an autoethnographic account of PTSD, but it is as a result of me being formally diagnosed with PTSD as a consequence of my research. And look, thank you for asking what that definition is, because there are so many other terms out there that we academics love a good set of terms or definitions. And there's so many when it comes to this field. So we have so many other terms that exist alongside PTSD. Vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout, secondary traumatic stress. Those are all terms that people are going to encounter in the literature to, you know, be applied to basically what is the same thing. The reason that I say PTSD is because that's what I was formally diagnosed with clinically by a psychologist as a consequence of my experience. That doesn't lessen anyone else's experience, but it's just what I used to be academically correct.
And this is why I've said thank you for your generosity in terms of coming and to talk about this, because of your personal connection and investment in this work. So tell it. Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead, please.
I was going to say, so tell us a little bit more about your experiences and about the work that's come out of that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I was diagnosed with PTSD as a result of undertaking a very specific research project that was examining aspects of sexual abuse. And that happened a number of years ago. The reason I'm not going to, and so to be clear for all your listeners too, I'm not going to give exact dates or go into the exact, you know, aspects of that sexual abuse, simply because I had to jump through many different hurdles of ethics approval and that kind of stuff to get the piece published. And so, of course, a lot of things are anonymized or had information removed. But suffice to say that I was attached to a particular research project that was looking at particular aspects of sexual abuse. And as a consequence of that research experience, I was diagnosed with PTSD. In the piece that I published on this, the autoethnographic piece, I discuss how I undertook a series of interviews with people who had experienced these particular aspects of sexual abuse, and those interviews with survivors of these aspects of abuse were what led me to being exposed to this traumatic material and later experiencing all the signs and symptoms that led to the diagnosis of PTSD. So it took a while from more to go, as they say, from me going from that role in research to then experiencing PTSD and consequently needing to resign from my role as a researcher and taking on about at least 12 months, if not more, of formal clinical treatment for PTSD. So it was quite a long journey to undertake. And I ended up happily having that. I don't know how they say it in clinical terms, but I was no longer fitting within the category of PTSD as of about 18 months or so ago. So it takes a while for those experiences to or those symptoms and signs of PTSD to fade. It's a long journey.
It is a long journey, and I just want to really celebrate you having the support that you needed, reaching out for the support that you needed, and kind of coming through that, because as you say, that's a long haul.
It is. Yeah, it is. And look, in fairness, the support, I was lucky because the support was funded and initiated by me. So, and I guess that's one of the things that we're here to talk about is where and how there are holes in the academy and in research projects, because that support on my end was privately funded by myself. So I was the one that was paying out the money for the psychologist. I was the one that needed to resign from my job in order to receive treatment. So it's and I talk about this in the publication, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more here, but the university really did not do much at all. So that's one of the things that I think is really important to highlight, is that a lot of the time we're left a bit high and dry when it can come to these things.
And that's kind of the nub of what we wanted to talk about here. We talk generally about the difficulties of the PhD, but there can be some really particular, if you are dealing with particular material, if you are exposed to particular situations, there can have real severe psychological consequences to what's going on in that project. And of course, that's what you experienced. So tell us a bit about your learning from that, and your kind of what you would like to share, having come out of that and come out of the other side of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of different learnings, but I'll try and be succinct for the sake that we're not here for 2 hours, even though academics love to hear their own voice. So bear with me. The university system as a whole is not usually set up well to think about how we look after researchers. If you go through a standard here in Australia, it's called ethics approval, and I understand in other places it has there are other words attached to it, but for here it's called ethics approval, and as opposed to an institutional review board. When you go through that, you'll get asked typically a lot of questions about what you are doing to protect your participants, to protect the people, or, not even the people, but the subjects, again, another word that I don't like, that are involved in the research. And you'll get asked, how are you protecting them? What information are you giving them to help themselves after this? What phone numbers are you giving them to call if they experience trauma or anything like that? But typically there's nothing in there about what are you doing to protect yourself or protect the other members of your research group. And if you are undertaking a PhD, or if you are on a fixed term or casual contract, you are particularly vulnerable if you do experience trauma to how you actually are looked after. That's not to say that academics in ongoing roles are not any more or less liable to experience trauma, but simply that they have the ability to take sick leave. They have the ability to access more of the employee access program, the EAP. They have the full weight of the university to be able to access if they need, whereas fixed term, casual or PhD students have these threats hanging over their head of, if I take sick leave, I might not have a job when I come back, or I might not get paid, or if I, pause my project on the PhD, maybe they'll just get someone else in. So there are very different ways that we experience and negotiate trauma. And that goes right back to the ethics committee again. If you are submitting something to the ethics committee as a senior researcher who is, probably the ones doing this stuff, submitting things to the ethics committee or the IRB, then you are going to be the one that is in a senior position. You're probably not the PhD candidate a lot of the time. You might not be the fixed term or contract person. You may be the lead, and so therefore you're not as aware of what others might be experiencing or what those vulnerabilities are. So that's the individual sort of responsibility on the researcher or the research team. Of course, then there is the responsibility of the wider university, and how ethics committees and IRBs really fail in relying on heads of schools and PhD supervisors and grant holders to make these really subjective decisions about risk. How well you individually might negotiate these things, as opposed to what are you obliged to do to protect others, not just your participants, but also those on your team. How are you making sure that if they are exposed to trauma, they receive the appropriate levels of care? And how does that go beyond things like that throwaway line saying that if you are distressed, you'll go and seek help or whatever else? So what are you doing that's authentic in that regard? And in the piece that I published, I talk about trauma-informed models of care. So how do we actually start that from the beginning and say, well, you're probably going to experience a level of trauma and you need to accept that. So what are you actually doing to introduce that trauma-informed model of care into that wider ethics approval process? And you don't, if you told me 5 or 6 years ago that I would be suggesting putting more paperwork work into an ethics review, I'd be horrified because I know how tedious it can be. But it's not about the matter of necessarily just about the matter of paperwork, and it shouldn't be a box ticking exercise. It's a real opportunity to reflect authentically on the level of risk that you are putting yourself and others in line of as a consequence of your research, because everyone reacts differently. So you can't assume that just because you will be fine with undertaking a particular level of risk that others will be the same, or that they know what they're getting into.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we keep referring to this publication, which there will be a link to that in the show notes so that people are able to read more, because I'm sure people will be interested to read more on that. This is about duties of care.
Yeah, isn't it?
Duties of care.
Yeah. Universities are not always good at that, particularly when it comes to researchers and our independence as academics to research what we like. And I know that I think it's a difficult pill for many to swallow, to be told, well, you need to be doing this to look after yourself, because at the same time, it can feel very paternalistic to be told, well, you need to think about this and whatever else. And the deep irony of this, again, I don't miss, because in seeking approval for this publication to go out, I encountered again a separate institutional review board, a separate ethics committee at my current university, who were very wonderful and polite and caring about checking that I was okay, but also raised the fair enough question of, are you going to be okay if you publish all this stuff about your experience on PTSD? Which is a question that honestly I wished the institutional review board, the ethics committee at the previous university I was at, would have considered, levels of care when I was doing that original research project. So I've had those interesting experiences of, on one end, an ethics board getting really up in your business in some ways to be able to say, are you actually okay? And me saying, yeah, you know what? I've got a letter from my psychologist that says that I'm fine now. I don't have PTSD anymore, which actually happened. And I'm happy to talk about that. But, and on the other hand, another ethics committee having very much a hands-off approach, which eventually led to the diagnosis of PTSD.
Yeah. And I think that the words ethics committee will be provoking responses from people who are listening, I'm sure. And I think there's a whole another episode on ethics committees, and
there is, yeah. And it's not ethics committees alone. And it's I'm sorry if they've come in for targeting here. It's not my intention. It is the overall structure, because of course ethics committees can only do so much. It's the overall structure of how we understand research and the institution as a whole, and how that is often set out, that is the wider problem. And I think ethics committees are just one part of that, because at the end of the day, there's only so much any one committee or group of people can do. So it's not their approach alone. That's just one of the ways to address these issues of trauma, and particularly for vulnerable researchers. So to come back to that original point and how this is important for PhD students, they're particularly vulnerable. And I know that feeling because I've had it myself. When I was a PhD student, I had a lot of experiences, nothing traumatic, but just odd experiences in trying to locate people. I was interviewing a lot of feminist activists at the time, and I would meet them in public, or I would meet them at a library, and it's to try and avoid going to a stranger's house, for example, and to have that, be cognizant of that level of risk and be like, well, what am I going to do? Who am I going to call my supervisor once I finish the interview? Who am I going to, and how you capture that in the ethics process is quite interesting. But the vulnerability of PhD students and fixed term and casual researchers can't be stressed enough, because they don't have the ability to necessarily take as much sick leave. They don't have the ability to fall back on a lot of the different measures that ongoing staff do. It's all of the stuff in the literature that tells us how to protect ourselves from trauma points to things that they just can't do, like take breaks from listening to different stories, spread out the interviews to one every week or one every fortnight, reorganize your workload. None of that is really achievable for PhD students. So, and then you get to the power dynamics of debriefing with colleagues. And it's like, do you really want to be sharing with your PhD supervisor or your manager how you're having nightmares of whatever, and then you have to front up and have another meeting on your PhD the next week? Probably not.
Exactly. And I think this real sense is kind of looking after yourself on a whole nother level. This is not bath and candle time. This is like serious structural thinking, and also thinking about, because I think that we all like to think we're invincible, and we all like to think that we can go in and do all of this stuff. I think what's coming through really strongly from what you're saying is a sense of vulnerability, acknowledging that, and then thinking about how you can look after yourself within that, and how you can enlist support. I think professional associations can be really useful in this, in terms of getting guidance from there and thinking about how you can work with that. I wonder if you have any other thoughts on how people can look after themselves in this. I mean, we're coming to top tip time, so I'm wondering if that might be a top tip, but I don't want to put top tip words in your mouth. So it's
totally fine. It's totally fine. So yes, being cognizant of your actual limitations. So to spell it out in 10 seconds or less, when I was first diagnosed with PTSD, I thought that I would be able to continue working on the research project. And my psychologist didn't even laugh at me when I said that to her. And so when I had to resign 6 months later, she also didn't even say, I told you so. So it's, you're not often aware when you're in that state of trauma what your actual limitations are. But the actual top tip for me would be, when you commence a research project, it's so much easier to build all of these things into it at the front end, rather than trying to scramble behind the scenes when something actually happens. So I talk about in that publication, how researchers need to really plan for trauma in research. So all of those different things, undertaking trauma-informed practices that really realise the impact of trauma and the fact that it's probably going to happen to some extent, and what you can do about it, both in your when you proceed through ethics, in your practices in undertaking research, in that vulnerable space, in debriefing if that's something you want to go down the path of, and in receiving potentially preventative, or just as a form of debriefing, clinical care. So planning for trauma is a lot easier than experiencing it and then going, oh, well, what can we do now that you've already got PTSD?
Absolutely. And I love this in terms of the sense of, it's not just thinking about what's going to get me through the ethics committee. It is like, really, what is useful to me? And I'm going to plan. It's going to, it's like in A&E, isn't it? That they have all those drawers and all those cupboards with all the stuff in, just in case you need it. And hopefully you'll never touch it. Yeah. But it's there just in case. And I think this is just awesome advice. And I really would recommend people to kind of reference your work, because it is hard-won knowledge that you have. And I just, as I say, it's incredibly generous-spirited and really very wise. So thank you so much, Jess.
It's been my pleasure.
For all that you've done. I say for sharing your story, for sharing your work. I know that this will be of use to lots of people. So thank you so much. And thank you all for listening.